Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos. Welcome to Congregation Dor Tamid and our Friday evening Kabbalat Shabbat worship service. We are thrilled to be joined this evening as we welcome in Shabbat by our friends from Roswell, from Temple Beth Tikvah, and our friends and colleagues, Rabbi Shuval-Weiner and Cantor Kassel, who will be joining Mike and I in leading our service tonight. And we are also joined tonight, and I will do a more formal introduction later, by my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger, and his wife Ann. And it is great to have them both in Johns Creek from Fort Worth, Texas. So we come into this Shabbat, we come once again for a lot of reasons. We come because Shabbat offers us the opportunity to be together in community, to take a step back and rest and reflect, and as the Torah teaches us, to renew our souls. And we come for a variety of reasons: to seek the warmth of community, to say prayers for those who we are asking for a healing blessing for, and to seek the strength of our kahal, of our community, as we walk through the valley of the shadow. But whatever the reason is that we are here tonight, we are here together, welcoming in this Shabbat, this gift we are given each week, this gift of time. And we begin our service tonight as I ask everyone to just take a moment and turn off or silence your cell phones and make sure your masks are on the proper way, on page 128.
Please join us in singing Yedid Nefesh. Yedid Nefesh, Avarachaman, Avarachaman. Mishoch Avdecha, El Ritzonecha, El Ritzonecha. Yedid Nefesh, Avarachaman, Avarachaman. Mishoch Avdecha, El Ritzonecha, El Ritzonecha. Yarutz Avdecha, Kemo Aya Ishtachave, El Muadarecha. Yedid Nefesh, Avarachaman, Avarachaman. Mishoch Avdecha, El Ritzonecha, El Ritzonecha. Boi Kala. Boi Kala. Boi Kala. Boi Kala. Boi Kala. Sing those words with me. Boi Kala. Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala. Keep singing that. Hachamame Roshaila not nistalka, Bo venetze likrat Shabbat Hamalka. Hachamame Roshaila not nistalka, Bo venetze likrat Shabbat Hamalka. Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala, Boi Kala.
As we do each week, we welcome in Shabbat by bringing more light into creation. And so I'm going to ask everyone now to turn in your prayer books to page 120. And I'm going to invite one of our guests, Ann Mecklenburger, to come forward to kindle our Sabbath lights.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu le'adlik ner, Shel Shabbat.
We turn now in our prayer books to page 130 as we prepare to welcome in Shabbat with the Psalms that say, "Come, let us sing joyously to Adonai." Lechune Ranana, page 130.
Lechune ranena l'Adonai, Naria letzor yishenu, Nikad mafana betoda, Bizmirot Naria lo. Page 131. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash. Sing unto God all the earth a new song. I will sing unto God a new song. Sing unto God and we'll all sing along. All the earth a new song unto God. Sing with us. Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash, Shiru l'Adonai kol haaretz, Shiru l'Adonai shir chadash.
As the mystics in Tzvat did, we turn now to page 138 to welcome in the Sabbath bride with the singing of Lecha Dodi. Tonight we will sing together verses 1, 2, 5, and 9. And for the 9th and final verse, we will rise and face the door of the sanctuary, hoping to catch that glimpse of Shabbat as she enters our presence. Please join us.
Lecha Dodi likrat kala yalala 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 b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala yalala 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 b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi likrat kala yalala 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 b'nei Shabbat nekabela. Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Kabbalat Likrat Shabbat Lechu V'nelcha Ki Mekor HaBracha Merosh Mikedem Nesucha Sof Ma'aseh B'machshava Tehila Elecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Nekabela Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Nekabela
Itorari, Kiborech, Kuni Uri, 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 Shir Daveri, Kibod Adonai, Alayich Nigla.
Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai Yalalai Lalalai B'nei Shabbat Nekabela Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Nekabela Boi v'shalom ateret bala Gam besimcha uvtzola Toch emunei am segula Boi kala Boi kala Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Nekabela Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala Yalalai 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 B'nei Shabbat Nekabela.
Now that we have welcomed in the Sabbath bride and welcomed one another to this Shabbat, we transition into Mariv with the Shema and its blessings with the Hatzi Kaddish on page 144.
Yitkadash Shmei Rabba.
Amen.
Ve'alamad yiverach rutei ve'amlich malchutei. V'chayechonu v'yomechona u'v'chayed chol beit Yisrael. Bagala, bagala, u'vizman kari ve'imeru. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach. Le'olam l'olam me'almaya. Yitbarach, Yishtabach, Yitbar, Yitramam, Yitnaseh, Yitadar, Yitalev, Yitala, Shemei Kedusha, La'ela, Min Kol Birchata v'Shirata, Tushbechata v'Nechemata, Damiran me'alma ve'imeru. Amen. Yai, lai, 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 yai, lai, 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 yai, lai, lai, yai, lai, 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 yai, lai, 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 yai, lai, 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 yai, lai, 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 yai.
Please be seated. And we continue on page 148. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bidvaro ma'ariv aravim, b'chokhmah poteach sha'arim, ובתבונה משנה עתים, ומחליף את הזמנים, ומסדר את הכוכבים במשמרותיהם ברקיע כרצונו. בורא יום ולילה, גולל אור מפני חושך וחושך מפני אור, ומעביר יום ומביא לילה, ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו. אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, המעריב ערבים. Page 150.
Ahavat olam,
Beit Yisrael,
Amecha, ahavtav,
Torah u'mitzvot,
Hukim
u'mishpatim,
Otanu lemadeta, Al kein Adonai Eloheinu, b'shokbeinu v'kumeinu, nasiach bechukecha. V'nismach b'divrei Toratecha, ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד. כי הם חיינו לאורך ימינו, ובהם נגע יומם ולילה. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד.
Please join me in the chanting of Ve'ahavta found on page 154. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol meodecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. We continue responsively on the second paragraph that is found on page 157. In a world torn by violence and pain, a world far from wholeness and peace, give us the courage to say, Adonai, there is one God in heaven and earth. The high heavens declare your glory. May earth reveal your justice and love. From bondage in Mitzrayim we were delivered. At Sinai we bound ourselves to your way. Inspired by prophets and instructed by sages, time and again we overcame oppressive forces. And though our failings are many and our faults are great, it has been our glory to bear witness to our God, keeping alive in dark ages your vision of a world redeemed. Let us continue to work for the day when the nations will be one and at peace. Then shall we rejoice as Israel did, singing on the shores of the sea.
Mi chamocha b'elim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora teilot, o sefele. Mi chamocha b'elim Adonai, mi chamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora teilot, oh, say, felle.
Malchutecha, Romanecha, Bokeyam, Lipnei Moshe Miriam, Se'eli Anu Ve'amiru, Se'eli Anu Ve'amiru.
Adonai Imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai Imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai Imloch le'olam va'ed. Adonai Imloch le'olam va'ed. Let there be love and understanding among us. Page 161. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms.
Hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, Hashkivenu, L'Shalom.
Ve'ha'amidenu, shomreinu l'chayim, ufros aleinu, sukat shlomecha, hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, hashkivenu, L'Shalom, hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, hashkivenu, L'Shalom. Let there be love. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storm.
One of the greatest inventions of all time was the creation of Shabbat. Whether it was a gift from the divine or something that humanity realized, the idea of Shabbat, of a stoppage, is the most amazing aspect of humanity. The ability to take time to stop, to contemplate, to dream, to exhale. This is what nourishes us, and this is what keeps us functioning in ways beyond simply living. We gather as a people every week, and we embrace this gift of Shabbat. Our rabbis teach that it is Shabbat that has kept us a Jewish people, and it is Shabbat that allows us to maintain our humanity. We join together on page 162 as we sing this praise of Shabbat.
Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asod et HaShabbat leDorotam v'ridolam. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asod et HaShabbat leDorotam v'ridolam. Beini uvein b'nei Yisrael Oti leolam, oti leolam. Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asod et HaShabbat leDorotam v'ridolam.
כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ.
Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asod et HaShabbat leDorotam v'ridolam. Uvayom hashvi'i Shavat vayinafash Shavat vayinafash Shavat vayinafash Veshamru b'nei Yisrael et HaShabbat La'asod et HaShabbat leDorotam v'ridolam.
Rabbi Ottenstein, your shul really celebrates Shabbat. Very nice. Let's get one more. Woo for Shabbat. Woo! Nice. That's the best woo. We continue now on page 164 as we rise for our Amidah for the evening.
Yalla lai lai lai, 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 yalla lai lai lai. Adonai sifatai tiftach Ufi agit hilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai. Yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai, yalla lai lai lai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, Velohei Leah. Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, Vekonei Hakol, Vezocher Chasdei Avot Ve'imahot, Umevig Geula Livnei V'neihem, Lema'an Shemo Be'ahava, Melech Hozer Umoshia Umagin, Baruch Ata Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Ata Gibor le'olam Adonai, Mechaye hakol Atara le'hoshia. Mashiv haruach morid hagashem, Mechalkel chayim bechesed, Mechaye hakol berachamim rabim, Somech noflim verofei cholim, Umatir asurim, Umekayem emunato, Lishenei afar, Michamocha ba'al givurot, Umido melach, Melech memit umchayev, Umatzmiach Yeshua, Veneman atal hachayot hakol, Baruch ata Adonai, Mechaye hakol, Ata kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, Ukdoshim b'chol yom yehalelu chasela, Baruch ata Adonai, Ha'el HaKadosh.
We continue silently.
Il razzon imrefi, il razzon imrefi, Vagion libin lefanecha, Adonai tzuri begoali.
Oh, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of my heart be acceptable before you. O God, my rock and my redeemer. Ose shalom bimroma, Uyase shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael.
if you were to walk into my study, one of the things that would jump out, and one of the questions I'm asked a lot, is where did you get all these books? And if you go into any rabbi study, you're going to see books and books and books. But in my office, in my study, there are a few books that bear mentioning. Specifically, the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, and the Mishneh Torah, a book of Jewish law written by Maimonides. These books, which were written in the 1800s, or published in the 1800s, these specific books, were owned originally by a rabbi who gave them to his grandson, a rabbi, who eventually said, these need to be held by a rabbi, and were given to me. And as I look through and at these books, I'm reminded not only of the wisdom held within, but of the wisdom that I learned from the rabbi who gave them to me. He has served as a mentor, a colleague, a friend, and truly has shown me what it meant to be a rabbi, both in a general sense and also in the day-to-day work that we rabbis do. And that rabbi is our esteemed guest and scholar, Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger. Currently serving as the Rabbi Emeritus of Bethel Congregation in Fort Worth, Texas, Rabbi Mecklenburger graduated magna cum laude from the University of Cincinnati in 1968 and was ordained upon graduation at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1972, who also awarded him an honorary doctorate of divinity in 1997. Prior to coming to Fort Worth, Rabbi Mecklenburger served congregations in San Francisco and in Ann Arbor. He has been involved in communal affairs locally and nationally, serving as adjunct faculty member at Bright Divinity School, TCU, and for many years he chaired the Texas Conference of Churches Jewish Christian Forum. He has been on boards of Community Hospice of North Texas, Jewish Federation of Fort Worth, and Jewish Family Services. He's been a member of the Fort Worth Human Relations Commission, vice chair of the United Way, and I could go on and on of all the ways that Rabbi Mecklenburger has served both the Jewish people and the broader community. In 2012, he published his first book, Our Religious Brains, What Cognitive Science Reveals About Belief, Morality, Community, and Our Relationship with God. And just last year, he published his next book, Why Call It God? Theology for the Age of Science. And I should note, he has been, for myself and Rabbi Shuval-Weiner, our boss. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Ralph Mecklenburger tonight to Congregation Dor Tamid.
Wow, you don't get that many introductions of that warmth and style. But I'll tell you, when I and a couple of people from Bethel and Fort Worth went to Cincinnati interviewing for an assistant, Jordan Ottenstein, was head and shoulders above all of the other. You don't get to interview everybody, but nevertheless, of the panel we had, there was no question this was the guy we wanted. And then once we got him to Fort Worth, Marnie was there, and at that point, one child, and then pretty soon, two children, and he just became a part of the Bethel family. And we still miss him, but what a lovely spot. And as was noted, what an enthusiastic worshiping group. This is a great place. Alex Shuval-Weiner, also now a rabbi, was in Fort Worth, 106 years before that, long before she became a rabbi, but everybody saw in her great potential. She was a wonderful educator for the congregation. The kids loved her, the parents loved her, and so on. And the only thing I have to add to that, in addition to it being such a pleasure to be here for them and with them, I have a little history in North Atlanta and North Georgia as well, because when I was a rabbinic student 250 years ago, I spent several very nice summers at Coleman Camp, the then UHC, now URJ camp, not too far from here. So what a great pleasure to be back. As you just heard, I've written a book, a little free publicity here, called, all right? It was the second book, but you don't have to have read the first to understand the second. Well, after I became a rabbi, I got interested in a field which I found really personally meaningful, but also important for modern Judaism and indeed for the modern world, cognitive studies. First we called it neuroscience, but it includes a whole lot of psychology and such. It's not just neuroscience. How do our brains work? And why then might we believe some of the things that we believe and practice some of the things religiously that we practice? A couple of examples, this would be from the first book, but what exactly is a soul that it could survive a body? Can it? How much free will do we really have? That's the sort of thing that was in the first book, and I intentionally stayed away from dwelling on my idea, and many people's ideas, of a naturalistic God, of God not as a supernatural character, but as the way the world works, as the order, the philosophy behind existence. I thought if I dwelt too much on that God concept, what was already controversial in the book, talking about neuroscience and religion, would get overshadowed by it. People might be upset or offended or whatever. But then when I went, as I'm doing right now, around the country talking about the new book, most of the questions that people wanted to ask was, well, if that's your idea of God, then what's the purpose of prayer? If that's your idea of God, where does revelation fit in? And so on and so forth. They kept coming back to subjects about God. So I realized if I were going to write a second book, which I hoped someday to do, it really needed to include the concept, to be focused on the concept of God in this scientific era of ours. There are lots of metaphors for God. All God talk is metaphorical because we don't fully understand the divine. Nobody does. So we see God as sort of analogous to us, except far greater than us, and so on and so forth. But we talk about God as king and as judge and as parent, and so on and so forth. Anthropomorphic, human sorts of metaphors. But there are non-anthropomorphic metaphors in Jewish history, all the way back to Philo, 2,000 years ago, who was a Platonist. But then Maimonides was already mentioned tonight, an Aristotelian in the Middle Ages who talked about God as a pure mind thinking itself and evolving a universe in the process. Or Spinoza, more recently, the mathematical perfection of the universe is what he called God. Or in our American 20th century, Mordecai Kaplan, some of you probably know that name, he talked about God as a power making for good. But if God isn't a conscious personality necessarily, but can be understood more abstractly or philosophically, I like to talk about God as the order of being, the way the universe works. What is prayer all about? And spirituality and messianism. You sense it here tonight. It works, it helps, it's meaningful. But how does that work with a more abstract God concept? So tonight I thought I would dwell on prophecy because 2/3 of the Bible is prophetic literature. And then the early rabbis and modern rabbis, lots of us, read the remaining third of the Bible as if God gave us word for word all of this wonderful wisdom. Well, how can that be? I started researching prophecy. I studied it book by book, but as a concept. Right? Started researching, and I found that the medieval Jewish Aristotelians, like Maimonides, discovered 1,000 years ahead of me that in a scientific worldview, that doesn't quite work. How do you and I talk? Well, we use our tongues and our mouths, right, our larynx, to form sounds. But we don't believe God has a body. How did God talk, in quotes, to prophets if he didn't have any vocal mechanisms? Well, these philosophers like Sadja Gaon and the Rambam came up with some clever answers. God created an angel who was physical and therefore could have a mouth and talk. That's not going to fly in your child's biology class or our own world today in general. So the medievals were way ahead of us in recognizing that there is an issue here, but it takes a while before we really start to get into the subject. And in modern times, with science to help, the theology can shed some light on the science, and the science can shed some light on the theology as well. So let's first say, how did the prophets themselves think prophecy worked? I mean, did all of a sudden words came in their mouths and they just came spilling out? That's weird, right? Well, Isaiah, you'll recognize the passage in chapter 6, describes an angel, a whole bunch of angels flitting around saying, holy, 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 right? And one of these angels takes a pair of tongs, and he takes a hot, white-hot coal off the altar, and he touches Isaiah's lips with it, purifying his lips. And then Isaiah is told, now you shall go forth and speak my words to the people. Beautiful poetry, beautiful symbolism, but pretty tough to take literally, especially that part about the hot coal touching his lips. Not in the 21st century. We can't really buy that literally. It's great literature. We love it. But what are we going to do with it? Well, the key to nearly all of it, I could go through dozens of examples out of the Tanakh, the Bible, right? But the key to all of it, it seems to me, is a really interesting passage in Numbers 12 that some of you may recognize. Moses' brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, are jealous. They're out wandering around in the wilderness, and Moses is always up front, giving the orders, getting the covet, and Moses arouses the jealousy of his siblings. And they say, how come Moses always gets all the honors? We're prophets too, and in fact there are places in the Torah where each of them is called a prophet. God hears this debate begin to rage, and God is annoyed. And he summons the three of them to come forward in front of the tent of meeting, and he says, God does, he in quotes, right? When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision, I speak with him in a dream. Not so, my servant Moses. With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. Well, set Moses aside for a second and note, all other prophets, according to this passage in the Torah, see visions and dreams. But did Moses see God face to face? Only if God has a face, right? Which we Jews deny, right? God is wholly non-material, right? That too is poetry. To know somebody face to face is to really know them well. Moses has the answers, right? God is saying, right? Saying in quotes, right? But it's all poetry. You can't take any of it literally. Prophecy in biblical times, once you see that, is quite obviously, if not 100%, 90%, overwhelmingly dreams, and maybe daydreams, if that's what a vision is. Jacob, you'll recall, in becoming Israel, had a famous dream of heaven and earth linked by a ladder. Joseph interprets dreams for Pharaoh, and Daniel interprets dreams for the Babylonian Emperor Nebuchadnezzar. The prophet Joel imagines good times restored, and he expresses that as, in the future, your old men shall dream dreams, and your youth shall see visions. Those aren't accidental metaphors. That's going back to Numbers. Everybody's going to be a prophet. When Moabite king, not Jewish, right? A Moabite king, Balak, wants to hire a well-known local prophet, Balaam, to come and curse the Jewish people because they're moving through his territory and he's very worried, he sends a delegation off to see Balaam. And they tell him what they have in mind, and Balaam responds, I can only do what God actually tells me to do. I don't make this up as I go, right? So I'll tell you what, come back and see me in the morning, and I'll tell you what God said. What? Why didn't he just answer? He had to go to sleep first. He had to have a dream first. One more telling example, turn it around from the negative side. When Jeremiah gets frustrated that he keeps telling people, you're sinners, God is angry, the nation is going to be destroyed, what happens? Other prophets, in quotes, rise up and say, everything is fine, don't be silly. This guy is off his head, Things are all right. And Jeremiah complains in chapter 23 of the book of Jeremiah, nowadays everybody's having dreams, everybody's claiming prophecy. People say, I've had a dream, and then they speak this nonsense which really isn't from God. Only I'm the real prophet. God told me in my dream, don't listen to them. If your only evidence that God is talking is that you've had a dream, how can anybody else know whether to take you seriously or not? So what would happen today if you or I suddenly showed up at City Hall or the Congress or the United Nations and said, you name it, I've had a dream and God wants you to, you name it, stop having babies for 10 years because we're overpopulating. It's really a problem. You would say, what? Who told you that? Or actually more credibly, a prophet could come up and say, if we don't stop burning hydrocarbons, we're going to all end up extinct, the whole race. And you know how I know? God told me. What would we do with this person? We would laugh at him, probably. And if he seemed dangerous, we'd lock him up. Have you ever noticed, moving forward from the biblical example, that there aren't any prophets anymore? I mean, some people think maybe Martin Luther King Jr. or somebody like that was a prophetic figure. But there aren't Jewish prophets anymore. What happened to the prophets? Well, what happened was, in the early rabbinic period, the rabbis said, there's no need for more prophecy. God gave it all to us in this book, the Tanakh. Right? All we have to do is read it and properly interpret it. So if you want to know what God wants you to do in this or that situation, come to your local neighborhood rabbi and we'll interpret Scripture for you, and you'll know what you should do. Not so long after, those who became Christians said, there's one more prophet. Don't forget Jesus. But nobody after him. The early church declared the age of prophecy was over. And 600 years later, the early mosque said, Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, the last one, but there's no need for any more. Just read the books and we'll interpret them. Why? Prophets are destabilizing, upsetting people. Sometimes you have to lock them up. They threw Jeremiah into a pit at one point for a while. You can't prove whether they know what they're talking about or not, and people take them seriously, and you got to have all kinds of problems. The prophets were God-intoxicated people, but we have far better explanations in our day of what dreams are and how dreams work. Remember Freud, right? The interpretation of dreams. Or read modern psychologists about why we have sexual dreams and why people who go to college, I bet a lot of people are in this category, people who go to college throughout their lives from time to time have dreams of not being quite prepared for what they have to do tomorrow. They knew they were supposed to be ready, but they're not, and so on. And then you wake up and it's okay. It's because of all those final exams that you worried about when you were in college happened. I see a few people nodding heads. I have that once in a while myself. What's going on in your head comes out in dreams, except when you are not conscious. The sensor that is a natural part of brain operation isn't there to say, oh no, wait a minute, that wouldn't happen. Don't believe that. And so while you're asleep, you think it's real. Do we throw out prophecy? Well, God forbid. It's, again, 2/3 of the Bible. And this is brilliant literature. If we love Shakespeare and Homer without God having written them, why wouldn't we love Isaiah and Moses and Amos and so on and so forth? This is all part of the basis of our Western civilization as well as our Jewish love affair with our tradition. What a blessing that we have this literature. So I am convinced that the prophets of biblical times, the real ones anyway, were sincere, maybe a few of the false ones, right? But then how do we account for the apparent fact that they actually believed their dreams were from God, especially if God is the order of being and not a conscious personality who's putting words and stories into their mouths? So let me end on two cognitive studies theories, not my theories, out of the literature. Can't prove or disprove either of them, but ponder this. Number one, a Princeton psychologist named Julian Jaynes, about half a century ago already, wrote a horribly titled but very creative book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. You really want to grab that off the shelf, right? He argued that as human consciousness and intelligence evolved, there's a right brain and a left brain. You probably know the left is more abstract and linguistic, and the right is more emotional and so on, but they overlap. But nevertheless, there are two recognizable sides of the brain. And he said, before this period, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, the axial age, some historians call it, all kinds of new ideas were coming all over the world, not just in Judaism with the prophets. In that period, people started recognizing that there were voices speaking in their heads. We all have voices speaking in our heads. We know that they're, different parts of us arguing with other parts of us, conscience versus lust and things like that, right? So, we see a dog and it's growling a bit and we say, should I touch it or not? We don't say that aloud, but we hear it in our heads, and then with the dog we stay away, right? In that particular case, I could go through zillions of examples. Julian Jaynes, the psychologist from Princeton, said 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, these prophets heard the right-hand side of their brain with the left-hand, more verbal side of the brain, and they thought they were hearing a voice, an external voice, not just a voice within their heads. I'm not totally convinced, but maybe there's something to that, and keep that one in mind, perhaps along with this even more contemporary second example. Contemporary anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann of Stanford demonstrates in her book, When God Talks Back, that if you really expect to hear God speak to you, really believe God speaks and he's going to speak to you, you'll probably hear him one day. And she has evidence for it. Well, what would count as evidence for such a thing? I said she was an anthropologist, right? So instead of going off to the Trobriand Islands, she went to evangelical Bible churches, first around Chicago when she was at, I think, Northwestern, but then she moved to Stanford, so then around Northern California. And she interviewed evangelical Christians who have a different idea than you and I in a Reformed temple may have. They think, that God talks all the time. We just have to learn how to listen. And lo and behold, once in a while they hear God talk. Now she says the first time she noticed this, she was interviewing a woman who had been pondering whether or not to take a job. And all of a sudden she heard God say, "Don't take this one." So she didn't. And Dr. Luhrmann said to this woman whom she was interviewing, you didn't really hear a voice. He said, "Oh yeah, I heard a voice." She said, "Outside of you, not just in your head?" He said, "Yeah, I turned around, there was nobody there, but I knew it was God. I heard it." So once that happened to her, as she did her dozens and then hundreds of interviews with evangelical Christians, lots of them, 30%, she reports, said at one point or another they had heard God talking to them. She notes there are 90 to 100 million evangelical Christians in America. They can't all be crazy. They're not schizophrenic, maybe a few of us, but no, this is not abnormal if that's your expectation. If you really believe God's going to talk to you, eventually you'll hear God talk to you. We would not want to live without the works of great prophets. In their age, they believed God talked. It wasn't that shocking to have the experience. It was overwhelming, it was moving, but it wasn't something that made people think you were crazy. And so we have these great books. After they got the inspiration, they sat down and they wrote it down, mostly in poetry, and some of them are really great poets. Prophetic idealism, more importantly to you and me perhaps, is real. Make peace, feed the hungry, protect the vulnerable, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Prophecy was and remains a spoken and often literary expression of divine ideals. It is still valid and valuable, even if God did not personally, as it were, place the ideas in the minds of the prophets. Amen.
And with those words, we sing these words, Ma gadlu ma'asecha Adonai. How wonderful are your works, O God. And we frame this with these words, Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Sing it with us. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Keep that going. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Keep going. Magadlu masechaya meodam ku machshevo Ma gadlu masechaya me'odam kumachshevotecha. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Ma gadlu masechaya me'odam kumachshevotecha.
With our hearts opened by those words of Torah that we were privileged to learn with Rabbi Mecklenburger tonight, we take a moment and think of members of both of our communities who are ill, some who are at home recovering, some who are in the hospital, some who have diseases and illnesses from which they may never recover. This week, we think especially of Linda Galler, Bev Mahone, Jerry Jacobs, Sylvia Kirsch, Alan Friedman, Sharon Rocco, Betty Olson, Sarah Kahn, Lee Silverstein, Jill Van Team, Eleanor Goodman, Yuli Makovich, Libby Routman, Laurel Phoenix, Marjorie Whitmore, Jerry Phillips, Claire Levin, Paul Kershon, Reva Fisher, Chandler Jacobs, Brianna Jacobs, Leslie Knight, Bert Singerman, Stephen Schiff, Mateo Velasquez, Dr. David Mazel, Janelle Siegel, Rachel Davis, Max Jacobs, Kathy Waldner, Richard Zuspin, Susan Abrams, Christopher Denton, Jerry Gimple, Phyllis Lapin, Libby Katz.
And as is the tradition of Temple Beth Tikvah, for those who are following online, we ask you to add the names of anyone whom you know is in need of a Mishaberach to the chat, and any TBT members who are here that wish to share the names of individuals that they are wanting to pray on behalf. I ask you to add those names. Thank you. And we'd like to raise up the name of Erica Eberhardt, who came through surgery today, and we are praying for a refuah shlema for her.
In addition to all those we have named and all those we hold in our hearts, we also keep in mind and pray for all of those who are victims of violence around the world, and all of those who are currently battling and suffering from COVID-19. We also ask God to care for those who care for the sick each day, granting them health and hope, strength and love, as we turn to page 371 and ask God for this healing blessing for all of them and for all of us.
Misheberach avotenu mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misheberach imotenu mekor habracha leavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say,
We turn now in our prayer books to page 586 at the top of the page as we rise for Aleinu.
Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol, lateit gidula liotzer bereshit, shehu notes shamayim v'yosed aretz, umoshav yikaro bashamayim mima'al, ushchinat uzo begovhe meromim, hu Eloheinu enod. Anachnu koreim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu v'nemar ve'ayad Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz Bayom hahu, Yeh Adonai Echad, Ushemo Echad.
Please be seated. Page 595. Yesh kochavim she'oram magia arza, rak ka'asher hamatzmam avdu ve'enam. There are stars up above so far away, we only see their light long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with people that we loved. Their memories keep shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest night, these are the lights that guide us. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. Our thoughts now turn to those who have departed this earth, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every race and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death. At this sacred moment of our Shabbat evening worship, we think longingly and lovingly of those taken from us both recently and at this season in years past. Congregation Dor Tamid, this week, we are in the period of Shloshim, the first 30 days since her funeral of Jacqueline Britton. And we mark the yahrzeits, the anniversary of their passing on this Shabbat, of Laura Meyer, Sylvia Kaiser, Howard Greenwald, Kay Berman, Nathan Duke, Jeannie Baker, Gussie Bissell, Marvin Finkelstein, Victor Brenner, Melvin Asher, Herman Waldner, Rhoda Mann, Shirley Rahm, and Sophie Steinberg.
And those in the period of Shloshim from Temple Beth Tikvah, Ginny Smokler, Kathy Gordon-Levin, Milton Goldstein, Martha Mabel Meeks, Craig Bailey, Jean Hollander Lipset. And those whose yahrzeits are observed on this Shabbat, Robert Felser, Lana Kaufman Franklin, Barry Goldenberg, Eunice Goldstein, Michael Gordon, Aaron Jacobson, Wahid E. Corey, Lorraine Corson, Robert Levine, Leonard Robinson, Barbara Rubin, Milton Schlesinger, Irving Schmidt, Fred Schwartz, Loretta Tarshis, Dorothy Trilling, Jacob Wolf.
If you are remembering someone on this Shabbat, I invite you, if you are joining us online, to add their name to the chat. If you are here in the sanctuary, to share their name with us as my eyes meet yours. Zichronam livracha. May all of their memories be a blessing. And may we take their memories into our hearts along with the millions of our people who have no one to say Kaddish for them, and the thousands and thousands who have died as a result of the pandemic. So we take all of their memories together. Remembering them, we praise the name of God with the words of the mourner's Kaddish, rising together as one community on page 598. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach leolam l'amei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shmei d'kudsha b'richu. Leila min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbachata v'nechemata. Da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav. Huya aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn, and comfort to all the bereaved here and everywhere with the blessing of peace. Together we all say, Amen.
Ose shalom bimromav, uyase shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imeru, amen.
Please be seated. Shabbos, everyone. Just a few very brief announcements before we conclude our service with Kiddush and Motzi and a closing benediction. Following the service this evening, you are all invited to join us for our Oneg Shabbat, which will be held outside in our tent. So out of the sanctuary, just make a left, and you'll see it as you go outside of the building. So we hope you will join us for a Nash and to continue meeting one another, especially from the different congregations. And it has been tonight and is always a joy to be with the two of you in service and in programs and whatever we continue and will be doing together in the future. It is our tradition here at Congregation Dor Tamid on the third Friday of each month to celebrate anniversary. So if anybody is December anniversary, I'm going to ask you to please rise. Jeff, you're being pointed at. So as I come around, I'm going to ask you to loudly, so everyone can hear you, introduce yourselves, tell us how many years you've been married, even if you're flying solo tonight and your spouse isn't with you.
Ouch. Simon tov, a mazel tov, a mazel tov, a simon tov, a mazel tov, a mazel tov, a simon tov, a mazel tov, a mazel tov, a simon tov, yehelanu.
So the final announcement for this evening is that you are all invited to join us tomorrow night for a Nash and Havdalah and more discussion and learning with Rabbi Mecklenburger. But tomorrow night we'll be at Temple Beth Tikvah in Roswell. The address is
9955 Coleman Road in Roswell.
So we'll see you tomorrow night at 7 p.m. But in the meantime, let's say a Kiddush and a Motzi. We turn to page 123, and I invite you to please rise.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ava u'b'ratzon nichilanu zikaron lema'aseh bereshit ki hu yom techila lemikra'ei kodesh Zecher letziat Mitzrayim Kivanu v'acharta, v'yotanu kidashta, mikol hamim, v'shabbat kodshecha, b'ava uvratzon, hinchalatanu, Baruch ata Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat.
Amen.
Chaim.
We uncover our challah.
Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, we give thanks to God for bread. Our voices rise in song together as our joyful prayer is said. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz.
There we go. So in a moment, we will sing our closing benediction tonight, but it struck me that it is the Shabbat where we finish the book of Genesis, and how appropriate it is that our two congregations, our two communities came together on this Shabbat as we move from Genesis into Shemot, into Exodus. And we traditionally say these words as we finish a book, which are so appropriate to come together with. Chazak,
Chazak, v'nit chazek.
Be strong, and our continued cooperation truly strengthens one another. We will conclude with the blessing on page 642, Adonai Oz le'amo yitain.
Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai yivarech et amo. Adonai yivarech et amo. Vashalom. Adonai yivarech et amo. Vashalom. Vashalom. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai Oz le'amo yitain. Adonai yivarech et amo.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Yasher Koach.